Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring Swedish contributions to esoteric thought and culture. My guest is James Tunney, a Renaissance man, a poet, an artist, a scholar, an attorney. He is the author of The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism, and also The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution. He's also written 2 dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is. James is an Irishman living in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Thank you very much. Great to see you, Jeff. We're talking on Skype, which is a Swedish system, and we're probably on Ericsson, and you want to get on Spotify, I joke, which is another Swedish company, and IKEA shelves behind me, so some people think they're taking over the world.
Well, Sweden is a fascinating country. It's a socialist country, and we think of it as very secular, yet, like practically every country in Europe, it has a deep mystical tradition going back in its past.
Perhaps I'll make a few general comments about the Swedish context, and then we'll talk about the esoteric tradition. Sweden is a land, in Ireland they say Céad Míle Fáilte, which is 100,000 welcomes, and in Sweden there's nearly 100,000 lakes in Sweden. So has been quite defined by its geography in some sense. A very long country with a lot of forest and a lot of wood, and that has been very significant. And of course, relatively cold winters, which have had an impact. And the forest, for example, is very important in the Swedish psyche and the wood. And it's also very rich in natural resources. It always has been. And associated with that richness in natural resources, there has been a great familiarity with metallurgy, and associated with that, perhaps alchemy. And that has been important in relation to the growth of Sweden historically, in relation to, for example, King Gustav Adolphus and his military successes in the various wars at the time of the 30 Years' War. Metal was important, and the use of metal in relation to producing cannons and things like that. And up till today, some of the natural resources are very significant. If you look at the table of elements, for example, a lot of the elements were discovered in Sweden by Swedish chemists, and certain things like rare earths are plentiful relatively in Sweden. And as we see perhaps a world digital currency in the future, perhaps related to rare earths coming soon, Sweden again will find itself perhaps a player in those dimensions. And associated with that, in the 20th century, when it became very social democratic and industry became important, it was significant in relation to export of iron ore as a neutral country. It supplied both Germany and the Allies. And in those contexts, there's a spillover effect. So we see a certain tradition of alchemy, for example. We see a priest after the time of the Reformation, Hans Pauli was his name, and he was brought in to apply some magic to improve the production of a silver mine, because it was believed it was necessary to get rid of evil spirits that were in the mine. And there is of course, the legends associated with Sweden, going back to the Norse gods and Odin and Freya and Frey, and a whole stream and tradition through the Vikings, through the rune system, the runic system, which is quite significant. And also when you look at the prehistoric megalithic sites in Sweden, there's quite a lot of them, consistent with the development around the western seaboard of Europe, which people kind of forget about. that there was this very old megalithic culture in these parts of the world as well, and cultures and there are pictures and hieroglyphs, etc. that are there, and petroglyphs that are there still. So there's a quite a big history, and from there, we have the Swedish royal family has been significant in this story, and they've been quite interested in the esoteric arts. If we look at Gustav III, for example, in the 18th century, we see that he has a lot of contact with people doing esoteric things. For example, he used to go in disguise to a woman called Mamsell Arvidsson in Stockholm, and he consulted her about various things. And according to the reports, which seem quite genuine, she warned him about that there was a conspiracy against him, and she warned him that she would see a figure on his way home that night who would be a threat to him. So he was assassinated a few years after in 1792 at the opera, and she had anticipated. Now, I know you don't believe in conspiracies, and some of your guests don't believe that there are conspiracies, but there were plenty of conspiracies against him. And not only that, but he was engaged with an individual called Bjorn Rom, who participated and demonstrated conjuring in the way that we talked about, and brought him and others to an old church where he performed conjuring feats, although he was exposed as a charlatan. But we have this openness to explore in the royal family, to explore these things. And his brother, the Duke Charles, who later became Karl III, was very, very interested in magic and magical things. And when his brother was not in Sweden at one stage, there was another man called Ulfenklau who brought the Duke at the time to dig for treasure in Österlånggatan in the middle of Stockholm, and performed some other ceremonies. So at a certain stage in the royal family, there were two royals who had their own magic circles, and the Duke had his own room where he performed ceremonial magic, and there are recordings or descriptions of what they did or what it looked like, and he was very active in that context. So they exposed themselves to the whole gamut of esoteric arts, and they were involved in Freemasonry, but the spirit seems to be a kind of very open, exploratory context, and certainly Gustav III he wasn't duped easily, so he seemed to be just looking at, and of course, if it could give some benefit to him, it's kind of understandable why they would look for any possibilities. So, despite the fact that today it has changed, that Swedish people are often described as the most secular people in the world, that there is not much openness to spirituality in some senses, in the traditional sense perhaps. They may be open to Oriental practices, big interest in yoga and tantra and various things. They're quite open in that sense, early adopters. It's a culture where people are very focused on the body, on physicality, on material things, and the whole political system is quite materialist in the sense of its conception of the individual, but it's a conception of a healthy physical body in a society that functions in a successful material way.
Isn't there an official Swedish Christian church?
There is a Swedish church which was established, which is predominantly, which is a Lutheran church. And this was established at the time of the Reformation. But the interesting thing about this established church is that everyone used to be compelled to join it. And those restrictions have been reduced. So it's not an established church any longer, but still there's a kind of degree of inertia that people are still attached to it. But the numbers are quite declining. But independent of the declining numbers, there is an interesting factor which is revealed by a succession of surveys over the years, that most people in the church don't believe in God that it's quite interesting. So that seems strange. And then if you look at the people that are practicing in that context, it seems to be a quite small number. And there is a book. I don't think it's available in English. There's a lot of interesting books in Swedish that don't seem to be available in English, to my knowledge. I can check that. But there's a book called 68 Kyrkan, which means the 68th Church, which explains about the influence of Marxism at the time in 68, similar to the way that it happened in relation to liberation theology in South America. But it seems to have been more successful influence here. So I think the Swedish Church in particular, if you look at the figures, it would give you, it would exaggerate the amount or the commitment to Christianity, I believe. I believe that the figures of practicing Christians is a lot smaller. Now, certainly there are other churches, free churches as they're called, and the Catholic Church, although the first cardinal since the Reformation was appointed a few years ago, and he's a very nice man. I met him because he came to two of my exhibitions. So we had some interesting conversations about the nature of grace, etc. But the Swedish Church is growing, or the Catholic Church is growing a little, but the numbers are very, very small. And Islam has grown in recent years. So the nature, the composition is quite difficult to judge because the official figures are not clear. But I would say that to make a generalization, in spirituality and metaphysics are not a big preoccupation because Swedish people are very physically active. They're very busy, engaged, very busy in community and clubs, and there doesn't seem to be the same or commitment to broad spirituality. That's a massive generalization. I know a lot of people will criticize that, but that's my broad brush idea of it.
You know, one of the impressions I've had of Swedish culture, and I think it's probably based on having watched a lot of Bergman films, is that because it's so far to the north, it gets very dark during the winter months, and that there's more depression. The Swedes seem to have sort of a dour personality, frankly.
You're setting me up for a fall here, Jeffrey. I would say, yes, it would make again a generalization that if coming from, say, Scotland or Ireland, from the Celtic countries, or Spain, where I lived in, there are certainly different dispositions. When you live in a climate which is very, very tough, it can have an impact. But of course, Swedish people are more influenced by international media, so the generalizations that one would have made a few years ago are changing. And then the country is quite multicultural now, so again, the generalizations are getting more difficult. A bigger factor may be the distribution of people, because if you think about a place like Hong Kong, and you have, and I find that the people in Hong Kong very nice. Our experiences there was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed the people of Hong Kong. But because the people in Hong Kong have to live in a very concentrated area, they have to be good at getting on with each other. But when people are distributed and they don't get the opportunity to engage with each other to a certain extent, that can have an influence. And of course, we have to remember that there are different groups of people that can come into Sweden, that we have this area, or the southern central part of Sweden, was inhabited by various tribes, often associated with the Goths or the Geats, and they were a people, or the peoples there were well known in different contexts. The story Beowulf is associated with that part of the country, and in the Baltic, on the east coast of Sweden, you have Gotland, and Gotland was very significant itself. Sometimes regarded as an independent merchant republic, but it had connections with Russia, with Ukraine, with Byzantium, and there were very real connections. And the Vikings traveled down through the rivers to these cities, and there was trade and influence there. And of course, in the north, we have the Sami people, the indigenous people, who are part of a kind of circumpolar northern people who come from a different Finno-Ugaric base, I believe, and from a northern connection. And they would be a traditional society with shamanism, with the reindeer herding. So it gets difficult to make generalizations. And of course, up the north, you have strange phenomena like the midnight sun, which can be very disorientating. But in another factor is that in winter, if it does snow, you do get a lot of lovely blue skies and revivifying cold, and the colour, the spectrum seems to change. You get a lot more, for an artist, you'd see a lot more orange and pinks in the sky. So there's swings and roundabouts, but so it may be difficult to make generalizations. But yes, it's true that they're a bit quiet and they sit back a bit, so they're not too interested in small talk, for example. That's a thing that has been noted. In fact, there's a woman in Sweden who gave classes on small talk because when she was in America, she realized that you had to talk to people in order to do business. So there's some truth in what you say.
And another factor I think most people don't appreciate is the influence of Nordic culture today. For example, the days of the week: Wotan, Wednesday; Thor, Thursday; Freya, Friday. The days of the week are named for the ancient deities of the Nordic culture.
Yeah, we have to remember that there was a big influence, a big movement of people between the Nordic countries and Britain and Ireland with the Vikings. And before that, when there was land connections, the people were moving around before that, when there was lost lands of Doggerland connecting Britain and the continent. And there was always people moving. There was always trade in fur and amber and people traveling in boats. And the Vikings traveling perhaps with their sunstone, using light to travel to other contexts. So they were quite influential for the relative numbers, and we have to see a context where there was a lot more trading influences between the places. Yeah.
And it's said that the Vikings settled in Russia and became the rulers of the Russian people. I think the Vikings were called the Rus, who went into Russia.
That's right. There's a lot of you get different opinions, but there does seem to be a great connection between the people from Gotland and from south and central Sweden, the Goths, and Ukraine and Russia, and there is some evidence that they were the people that were described as Rus from the start. But again, loads of people will contradict that. But it indicates that there were different connections and different trade routes going on, and there are some indications of connections with the Arab world going back hundreds of years, and a Jewish influence and links with the Khazar people, and so it is quite interesting.
And I suppose we have to mention the Vikings were particularly known as warriors.
They were. You get a lot of different views these days, because there are people that want to paint them as traders who come over knocking on the door selling fish or something. But yes, they were raiders. Other people say, well, there was different rules that came over and they used to engage in battle under similar rules. But if you look back on the west coast of Ireland, the stories are there of the seas are rough tonight, so we'll be able to sleep quietly and not fear the Norwegians coming in their boats. And I was down in Mayo one time, and there was a man explaining that he had found a souterrain, which they believed was used by people to hide when the Vikings were coming. So the Vikings, of course, when they came in the 8th century and 9th century to Ireland, attacked the monasteries, and those histories are there in Lindisfarne in Britain. So they were certainly warlike. They took slaves as well. The effort to just paint them as a purely trading entity is mistaken. And there were different times. They were obviously, with so much access to the Baltic and to lakes, they had great experience of boat building. They had the trees, the oak, whatever, to make their boats. They were very skilled technicians, and they were able to take advantage of that to engage as every other people did around the world. So
I do recall, because I've had some experience with the Viking Ocean Cruise Line. They have in their large ocean-going ships tapestries that were created after the Battle of Hastings in 1066 AD, in which the Normans conquered Britain. And they point out, they're very quick to point out, in fact, that both sides of that battle were essentially in the Viking tradition, using Viking implements of war.
Well, Norman, yes, and Norman refers to the North and Norse who had settled in that area, because they had raided Paris, and they had come down through the French rivers as well. So the idea is that the Normans who occupied that part of France were from the Northlands as well. And of course, when they were attacking Britain, they were attacking areas which had been largely ruled by Danes as well as Anglo-Saxons. And you had the Danelaw area in Britain. So there's a lot of truth in that, although I've been quite interested in recent years of trying to see to what extent the Normans were or had Roman connections. I think there are more Roman connections there than we think, and it may explain some of their particular interests in law and military systems. So, but that's true, basically true, yeah.
To get into the esoteric culture of Sweden, pretty much people associate Swedenborg with Sweden because of his name. I mean, the name of the country is part of his name. But I gather that the irony is that Swedenborg, who was a great mystic, had a greater influence outside of Sweden than within it.
You're absolutely right. That accords with my experience. When his family were ennobled, his name was Sveberg, I think, initially, or Sveborg, and then they were ennobled and became Swedenborg. But it's absolutely true, in my view, that he is known. And when I asked people initially about years ago, when I got interested in the figure, what do you think about Swedenborg? Or a lot of people never heard of Swedenborg, and there are particular reasons for that. I'd associate it with the movement towards a very material culture, which is leaving behind a lot of its, to make a generalization, a lot of its heritage. But Swedenborg is a fascinating figure, and you have discussed him with Gary Lockman before, so I won't go over the main details. People can look at that video. But so he's born in 1688, and his family were quite well to do, and he's a very talented man who becomes very accomplished in metallurgy and engineering, who works in the Swedish mines as an assessor. He's very good technically. He begins to study the body, the brain, to try and understand how everything worked. He was a kind of polymath. And he worked within administrative contexts in Sweden. He traveled around on a number of excursions around Europe. He learned off people. He had very, very good connections. People say that was because he was in the secret societies and had good connections as a result of that. But that doesn't take away from his accomplishments. He designed a flying machine, which I think is in the Smithsonian Institute. I don't know if it ever flew, or if it can fly, but he was interested in designing new things. A machine gun, for example, another thing he supposedly designed. So he was thinking about all the very creative individual before he began to commit himself to his mystic path, which didn't come till a lot later, when he was in his 50s, when he had a mystical experience. He describes it as the creator, as God, as far as I understand it. Sometimes it's Jesus, but when he's in London and God appears in the corner and tells him that he's eating too much and begins to converse with him. And from there, he begins to be able to travel to heaven, to the various heavens. And he's probably the person who has described the afterlife as, in whatever form, in the most comprehensive way ever done. So he explains the afterlife, the different systems, and suggests that he is being there. He explains that the greatest message that he got was that people were not to interpret the Bible literally. And this is a very interesting aspect. So when you look at his descriptions of the Bible, the book of Genesis, it's a spiritual interpretation. So the 7 days of creation don't actually mean the 7 days of creation. So there's a whole different number of layers. And this is consistent with the idea of mystics in the Judaic tradition, where they say that the worst interpretation of the sacred texts are the literal translations. They're dark translations. You have to get at the deeper meaning, which is important in relation to people who want to use sacred texts literally to achieve purposes that are inconsistent with the creative and compassionate spirit of these documents. It's very, very important. But he championed this idea of mystical experience of the individual, that the individual had access to these worlds and the individual could move between them. So he developed a whole spectrum of theories based on light and of angels to explain to people what happens afterwards and how this informs our life. Now, if you look at what happened to him afterwards internationally, we know that he had a big influence in London, on Blake, and then on the American transcendentalists, on Emerson, and on William James's father, Henry James, which I think informed a big part of William James's worldview, whereby he could balance the scientific, radical, empiricist method with some openness to mystical experience. I think that's a direct connection from Swedenborg. If you look in Sweden, quite early on, from the start, there was a hostility towards Swedenborg, and this was manifest in the 1790s when some of his followers, or people that were open to him, like August Nordenskjöld, who was very interesting, writing about light and the nature of light, and had been in London. He, for example, and other people like Silverhjelm were interested in other things such as mesmerism. And Silverhjelm had met Mesmer when he had gone on a tour. He had been a general in the Swedish army, I think, and he'd been to Paris, and he'd brought back ideas from mesmerism. And he set up shop in Stockholm, in the Old Town, which is an island where the palace is, right in the center of Stockholm. He set up mesmerist or hypnotic kind of therapy, similar to the way Mesmer did it with metal. Now, so this was in the 1780s. By then, in Paris, people like Benjamin Franklin had studied mesmerism and concluded that it wasn't an electromagnetic effect, it was something in the mind. So they seemed to know that this was a mental effect. So we know today that the placebo effect is very, very important, and the power of suggestion is very, very important. So there were records of people who seemed to be independent as far as I can see, who had witnessed people coming to these sessions and having been cured. But the rationalists, sometimes informed by the Lutheran tradition, but more probably Enlightenment scientific figures, didn't like this, and they had a campaign of vilification, such that this mesmerism stroke Swedenborgian experiment was ended. So we see an early kind of reaction against some of these ideas. But one figure that he did have a big influence on in Sweden was Strindberg. And Strindberg is a very important figure. I think we should talk about him some other time because he's such an important figure. But Strindberg, for people that are not familiar with him, August Strindberg, I came across him first as a painter. He was a very interesting painter, ahead of his time. He was also a novelist. He wrote a book called The Red Room, which was very influential, not least on Joyce, in my view. It is set in Stockholm again, in this area. He was a master playwright that influenced everyone from Eugene O'Neill to filmmakers to like Jodorowsky, and the techniques in his plays were based on his philosophical evolution. For example, he began to say, well, time and space doesn't exist, therefore I can utilize the technique as if time and space is not chronological. So in plays like the Ghost Sonata and the Dream play, Drumspelet in particular, he applied these techniques in his plays, and it was very, very, very influential. But he was also connected internationally. He went to Berlin, where he was friends with Edward Munch and another man who described himself as a Satanist, Stanislaw Szyszewski in Berlin. They formed. He was exploring, and both Munch and Strindberg were exploring ideas of anti-Christianism, of what happens after Darwin had come along and changed the world. And they were tending towards a kind of existential, occult viewpoint at that stage. And Munch was very, very interested in Nietzsche. And Nietzsche and Strindberg corresponded. Now, Strindberg moved on from Nietzsche, and he changed his view on him, because there was a general, in the zeitgeist, there was a general anti-Christianism, anti-Judeo-Christianism at the time. But Strindberg moved on. It's interesting as well that another family associated with Sweden, of course, is the Nobel family, and the Nobel Prize, and the paradox of developing dynamite and nitroglycerine and being involved, for peaceful purposes. But also, there's a bit of a paradox there in that one of the Nobel brothers designed the first oil tanker, which was designed in Gothenburg, and that before Nietzsche wrote Thus Spake Zarathustra, was called the Zoroaster. So Zoroaster was knocking around, and it was called Zoroaster because it was intended to bring oil from Azerbaijan and Baku and places where there was flames associated with the oil field, and Zoroaster was associated with that. So that's another interesting connection. But Strindberg moves on to Paris, and in 1896 he starts a series. I just show you the size of these diaries. There are a number of these diaries called the Occult Diaries that he started, which are very famous. They've been quite influential on their own. And he also wrote a book, Inferno, and that describes his experiments with alchemy and his experiments when he was trying to be a scientist, but he was trying to be an alchemist as well. And that affected him. He was going through another breakdown, just as kind of Swedenborg had done before his mystical experience. And some people believe he had some kind of he was becoming psychotic, but it's that characteristic breakdown at the base before a mystical experience comes on. And then the person that came to him was Swedenborg. He became open to Swedenborg, and he changed direction. And he changed direction, again, like the left-hand, right-hand path that we talked about. He changed direction back, and the figures that influenced him thereafter was Swedenborg, Shakespeare, Goethe, and he became more open to religion, because what he said, which is very interesting from his experience, he said that if you abandon all connection to positive higher forces, you become open to spiritual powers that will attack you. So he was convinced that by abandoning commitment to a higher ideal, that you became prey to psychic and spiritual unseen forces. And the very first page on this book as well says that if you want to engage with the unseen, you first have to look at the seen world with open eyes. So he is a figure that was heavily influenced by Swedenborg. Now, and Strindberg was a big influence on Bergman. We can see the influence of Strindberg directly on Bergman. He was the one that gave that occult dimension to certain of his films, because he employed the techniques he had seen in Strindberg. He had, of course, performed or organized the plays and directed the plays. And in fact, I've been communicating with one of your viewers who worked with Strindberg, which is very interesting, and she has been sharing some insights from her experience of those characters. Annalie.
You mean worked with Bergman?
With Bergman, yeah, in the theatre, and Max von Sydow and all these figures. So she's been informing me a bit of, and we've discussed certain films, but the three films in particular that where Bergman looks at certain esoteric dimensions. Of course, that Kunde Inseglet, The Seventh Seal, is the most significant and is regarded as one of the great films of all time by certain people. And that's certainly an exploration of the nature of death, which is very, very interesting. We also have Smultron Stellet, or Wild Strawberries, and in the film Wild Strawberries there are certain scenes which are set in Stockholm and Gamla in the old town, and if you understand that Strindberg had been saying that time and space don't exist, you understand how Bergman employed that idea, taking it directly from certain of Strindberg plays. Bergman took it and applied it in a cinematic context and was therefore very, very influential. And another film which is very, very interesting is a film in Swedish. It's called Ansiktet, which means the face, but in English it's called The Magician, which is a film. Both these films came 57, 58, as far as I remember. And in Ansiktet with Max von Sydow, beautifully shot film, I think it was Gunnar Fischer was the cinematographer. Bergman used two very good cinematographers that gave that look and feel to his film often. And in the Ansiktet, it's called The Magician in English, and it was based on or inspired by a story by G.K. Chesterton. And G.K. Chesterton had written The Magician, a tragedy, I think it was called. And he had also written other stories such as The Diabolist, and explored the dark dimension before he changed to Catholicism.
I wonder about the influence of theosophy and anthroposophy. I mean, anthroposophy in particular became a big European movement, and I imagine it would have had inroads in the Swedish culture.
It did. That's right. Again, in some of these contexts, the Swedes are early adopters. They get in quite quickly. For example, if we take in the telephone context, again, Ericsson are probably helping us with this broadcast, but Ericsson was an inventor who designed the telephone after reverse engineering the original telephone that had a patent, but there was no patent in Sweden. So he was able to develop it in that context. So they are early adopters. And theosophy is very, very important. We must remember, I think we have to locate back a little, that Swedenborgianism was seen as theosophy and described as theosophy. So in many senses, what came afterwards was following on from those theosophical ideas. And another figure, before we develop that point, associated with Swedenborg was Linnaeus, Carl von Linné, the great taxonomist. Now, an interesting point is that they were related. Swedenborg and Linnaeus were related to each other, and Swedenborg was appointed to the Swedish Academy of Science by Linnaeus. Now, Linnaeus believed in God, but he believed that God manifested himself in the order around, and that's why he wanted to chart every known living species. And it is from him that we have Homo sapiens and the idea of who we are and the idea of the great taxonomy. And it's interesting that when Darwin presented his paper on natural selection in 1858, now people forget that there was two papers presented in parallel, that there was Darwin's paper and there was Wallace, because the theory of evolution was written by two different people. The difference, of course, was that Wallace believed that there had been a spiritual intervention. If we had followed the Wallace idea of evolution, we'd probably more akin with the stream that comes from Swedenborg to William James. It's quite interesting. But the significant thing is that those two papers were presented at the Linnaean Society in London. So in many ways, the Darwin theory of evolution was trying to fit in and follow on from the classifications that Linnaeus had made. So it was very, very significant impact. And there were other people around in the Academy of Science at the time, like Celsius, for example, who gives us the thermometer readings and the scale, and Celsius and Swedenborg had disputes. Celsius was pointed out errors that Swedenborg had made. But so that theosophical tradition is there, in contradistinction to the more to other ideas of natural theology that Linnaeus tried to develop. But it doesn't seem that Linnaeus was very interested in the afterlife in the way that Swedenborg was interested. So when theosophy comes along, you know, and you've talked in many of your talks about Blavatsky and where it came from in that form, but it came into Sweden quite early and began to influence certain of the painters there, and in particular, and the ideas of spiritism and spiritualism had a bigger impact in Stockholm. And if we look at the 1890s was a critical period. For example, in the 1890s in Stockholm, in the mid-1890s, we have Edvard Munch exhibiting 50 paintings or so. He didn't sell any of them, but he was exhibiting his painting. He's Norwegian, but he exhibited his painting. The Scream, for example, was exhibited in Stockholm at that period. We also have Hilma of Klint, which we can talk about, who is a theosophist, who begins to engage in seances with De Femme, they call themselves the Five, and other bodies, the Edelweiss Verbundet, for example. So she begins to operate in 1896 to 1906 in seances because of her theosophical background. And we also have Aleister Crowley coming and having his first mystical experience in the mid-1890s at the Grand Hotel in Stockholm. So again, we can see very, very heavy international forces because of the great interest of people, particularly at the higher levels. I mean, there is the lower levels, there is the folk magic, there is the magic going back to the Viking period. So, for example, when we see the theosophists in Stockholm, and Hilma of Klint is one of the best examples, she's in an older tradition. The older tradition that I see goes back to the Viking times. There were these figures, the sorceresses. They were called the vulva. There's no other way to pronounce it. It's not a reference to female anatomy. It's an older word associated with the staff that these sorceresses carried. It's not related to Volvo, which is related to turn and the Latin. So these figures were sorceresses. And according to the Norse records and Icelandic records, they were, and also according to archaeologists and to the material evidence which has manifested itself in various graves across these countries, they were women who were professional seers, who could remote travel, who could engage in shape-shifting, who could predict the future, and they were held in high esteem, and they would sit in a chair. They had a staff. They often dressed strangely in cat skin and various figures, so it's certainly a precursor of the witch, and that word seems to be of Nordic origin as well. But they had a lot of respect, and they were feared. And in the burials that have been excavated by archaeologists in contemporary times, they find these like a crozier, a wand, a staff that these women used. The men had swords buried with them, and it was seen to be unmanly to engage with the spirit world. So I know we have the chalice and the blade, but the division seemed to be that the men with the swords were dealing with the material world, and that the women with their staffs were dealing with the spiritual world. So there was a division of function of people like Camilla Paglia has talked about. Was important. So from the Viking period, of course, we get the great mystic of the Middle Ages, Saint Brigitta, in the 1300s. So Saint Brigitta is a woman who was known all around the Christian world, Saint Bridget, if you like, a Bridget following on from the Irish Bridget, the Christian saint, and the pagan figure. So it's she's an archetypal figure across Europe, not just in the Celtic world. And Brigitta was one of the richest women in Sweden at a certain time. She had 8 children. She took a vow of chastity after that when her husband was still alive, and then he died. And after he died, she had mystical experience. She had visitations, the same as Swedenborg. Now, if you look at some of the descriptions, not that long ago, by critics, if you like, by a more scientific materialist disposition, they're very, very critical of this idea that she had genuine mystical experiences, and that they say, oh, well, she was suffering from repressed sexuality because her husband died, and awful things. But people are a bit more familiar with mystical experience. So she sets up her order of nuns that are very influential. She had travelled to Santiago de Compostela. She later went to the Holy Land. She went to Jerusalem. She went to Bethlehem. When in Bethlehem in 1371, I think, she had a vision of the Nativity, and she described what she saw. And when she came back to Italy, because she moved to Rome, when she came back to Rome, she described that vision, and she was very well known. And that vision was utilized by artists during the Renaissance. I think Niccolo Tommaso used it, and other artists used it to describe the nativity. So it's very familiar to us, that kind of picture of the nativity scene. It came from Saint Brigitte. She had visions all through her life. She intervened in politics. She believed the church had to be reformed. She had advice for the Pope and for everybody. She was a very, very significant figure. The first, if you like, female writer she's regarded as in Swedish terms, but a very, very significant mystic. So in some ways, this tradition is there going up to the Theosophists, and it was taken up, the Theosophists like Hilma of Klint, but not just Hilma of Klint. There was the other women at the time that were engaged in the seances, but we have other artists like Lucy Lager-Bielke, who's not so well known, and Tira Klein is another one at the same time. So there are many women involved in Theosophy and the other activities. And in the stream of Freemason, according to the books I've read on Freemasonry in Sweden, there were certain organizations which allowed women to join. So it wasn't exclusively male preoccupation. And I believe there's a crossover from the Freemasonic explorations into some of these other activities, and probably more than people think. There are books that I've read, they're not available in English, this is about the Brotherhood of Secrets. There's another recent one about the turn of the century in Sweden and the various esoteric forces that were in operation. So there is a story there to be told in relation to what was going on in Sweden and what was distinctive about it, and also how it was influenced. And in the theosophical point, Hilma of Klint, as Theosophy began to break up in its organizational structure, she was interested in Steiner's movement and anthroposophy, and she got to know Steiner, and Steiner came to see a particular series of paintings that she had done called the Temple Paintings, when she was told by one of the higher masters that he wanted her to do these paintings. She did 193 paintings in this series from 1906 to 1915, amazing big paintings, which when exhibited at the Guggenheim a few years ago was the biggest attended exhibition ever. Now, she told her family not to exhibit these paintings till 20 years after her death. Steiner said that they shouldn't be exhibited until 50 years after her death. Now, it's an interesting discussion about what was going on there. She only came back into public consciousness after an exhibition in 1986 in Los Angeles. But Steiner wasn't too keen on them, it seems, or he was a bit apprehensive. It's a bit difficult to work out what his reaction was. But both Steiner and Blavatsky didn't believe that you should give over your body to a higher force in order to paint or to receive such higher knowledge. So Blavatsky was very, very cautious about that, and so was Steiner. And according to the descriptions of Hilma of Klint, and initially, particularly with the early paintings, she wasn't painting them herself. There was a force moving through her, and Steiner didn't like that. And they were doing in a very Christian context. They were doing it in a context of being guided by Jesus as well. They were very cosmopolitan sense, which is also consistent with the great mystic artist Georgiana Houghton, who did a great series of paintings in the 1860s in London. And she's a fairly unknown artist. She fell into abeyance, is forgotten about, but she was doing paintings like this, which look like the cosmic art you've been discussing in one of your recent talks. She did this in 1864. So there were a number of women artists who have been forgotten about or ignored. Now the question is whether they just ignored because there were women. That's one view, but I think that is certainly there. But they were also ignored because they were dealing with the mystical world. And today there are some art critics who say, well, Hilma of Klint is not an artist or not a great artist. She's a mystic, as if they're different. So there's a very, very interesting debate about that.
You're suggesting that these forms of abstract, not representational art, abstract art, that emerged out of Sweden had deep esoteric roots.
Years ago, when I said I'm going to concentrate on painting, I did a survey of as much art around the world as I could, and I tried to look again at all the art I could. And I remember looking at Hilma of Klint, and I presumed at the time it was a type of abstract, decorative, illustrative work. And then a few years ago, I began to look at her notebooks, and I began to see an incredibly complex, evolved individual who was a leader in the sense of spiritual evolution. And then I began to see that the people who were commenting both on our notebooks and on our paintings were not so much into the mystical context. Because if you come from a materialist ideology, and especially to art, you're going to see certain things and maybe not want to see the mystical things, or not be familiar with the language and vocabulary. So I think it requires that one is a bit open. And of course, the big influence in this stream is Annie Besant. And Annie Besant, who had done in 1901 with Ledbetter the book on thought forms and the representation of thought forms, which was building on Blavatsky's work about trying to see inside, because of course at this period we have crooks and we have the X-rays and the idea of seeing into things. And Hilma of Klint was she had illustrated scientific journals, so she was very au fait with that world. And they realized they were trying to see into things, but they believed that science and the mystical world could go together. But I don't think a lot of scientists believed that it could go together. So this goes back to the Swedenborgian versus Linnaeus tradition, and in that sense, if you look at Klint, I think, or Larger Bielke, or Georgiana Houghton, I think in some way they're trying to represent the language of the higher dimensions. Now, for people that don't believe in the higher dimension, that don't believe in the spiritual world, that don't believe that they are spirits, they will find that nonsense. But it's not abstract in that sense. They are talking in a different language. They're talking about a different dimension. They're talking about things that are not two-dimensional, that are different forces. And there are certain symbols that recur. The 8 figure, the colors of the spectrum, the spiral is critical. And in some sense, Hilma of Klint did her spirals. And if you look at the structure of the Guggenheim, we have a spiral form, which is probably anticipated in some sense, you could argue, by her. And the Guggenheim itself, and Guggenheim, the founder, was influenced by certain theosophical artists. There was an artist in the early part of the 20th century who advised Guggenheim. So they were quite receptive to this view of spiritual art. So it's not abstract in the sense of how that is understood in the academy, because the academy as well, at certain stages become ideological, or there is a certain discourse which talks about mark making, and everything is mark making. Mark making for me is what my kids used to do when they were small on the wall. That's mark making. But at this context where they're saying that they're creating they're representing a higher dimension. And when you look at the paintings and you understand that you can't produce, as an artist, I understand you can't produce that consistent volume of work without having a very strong driving force behind you. And when that driving force is consistent with a lot of spiritual traditions, or someone who is au fait with some of these symbols can begin to see what's going on, you realize that we're talking about a higher dimension. And although Steiner and Blavatsky were concerned, if you look in Christian terms, by your fruits shall you know them, there's absolutely nothing in the work that's destructive, that could be construed as being evil, that could be construed as being negative. They're all elevating, and the work speaks for itself. So it is very, very interesting that these artists are being rediscovered. And my belief is that there are many more artists out there. And also, even in the royal family, there are some pictures which have been attributed to certain members of the royal family, which to me look very, very important in relation to the esoteric content, but they may have been kept out or not seen to be art because they were dealing with symbolism that was esoteric, perhaps associated with the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians. And Rosicrucianism was a very strong influence on these women as well.
Before we conclude our interview, I think it's important to mention that some very important parapsychology work is coming out of Sweden. I often refer viewers to a paper written by Edsel Cardania that was published in the August 2018 issue of the American Psychologist, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. It's a landmark paper, in my opinion, summarizing meta-analyses covering some 1,400 different experiments in parapsychology, and including that methodology was good, the statistics are incredibly strong, and as the research becomes more and more rigorous, the results do not decline. And of course, Edsel Cardania was working at the University of Lund in Sweden.
And you have interviewed him on your show, I recall. Yes, and also he has been a leading light as far as I can see, and he has defended at times the effort of parapsychology against people who perhaps had a hair trigger reaction to it or were a bit cautious from a more scientific materialist perspective. So that battle is still going on everywhere, but he seems to have done very well in his presentation of his arguments, and I certainly haven't heard any adverse things beyond that. But there was a bit of a media tiff a few years ago. But that's consistent with the historical example, because if we go back to the 1790s, when the mesmerism came, for example, we had critics and we had a range of views. But the same with conjuring. You had the king investigating the conjuring experiment, and then you had people, for example, hiding in a churchyard to expose what was going on. So to a certain extent, that openness or pragmatism, I think, is still there. But if you look at a lot of the great figures in Swedish literature, for example, another figure that we should mention is Selma Lagerlöf, which I think she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and a vast body of work. And she engaged in topics like the idea of the Antichrist. She wrote The Miracles of the Antichrist, it's described as in English, and other books about children's books, and books that referred to trolls and other figures and mythical figures in a Swedish context. So that folk magic was always there. There were also black arts books that were popular with people. For example, there has been a controversy about runes recently, that some politicians want to ban runes or certain runes because they associate it with the far right, which seems seems incredible in many senses to go after the thing itself. But the runes were used in certain parts of Sweden up until the 20th century, which is quite amazing. So that folk thing is there. You have that very pragmatic scientific domain as well, and certainly Lund and are open to that, and Edsel is doing good work there, and there are other associations that promote, not many, but are a bit open, but to a certain extent they may be struggling against the tide, because Sweden is a very scientifically disposed country. It's done well, and AstraZeneca is down the road, not far from here. It was the Swedish arm, again following on from the chemical background. They're very into that worldview, which is materialistic as far as I can see. But they're not that intolerant that they won't allow those spaces for people to explore the other dimensions. But I am concerned, as a general proposition in all these things, that we don't ignore the various streams. If people believe, for example, they've left Christianity behind, it's a big mistake to begin to write it out of the past. It's a big mistake to ignore the contributions because, for example, they were Christians, although the country doesn't see itself in those terms anymore because they want to be modern. It's a big mistake to forget their history, to not remember what's going on. And I think, and for example, Swedish prehistory is very, very interesting, but it seems to go against the grain of the contemporary, if you like, dominant left-wing social democratic disposition to emphasize any of these things, supposedly because it might support the far right in some sense, who want to use old ideas of Wotan or Odin or whatever, and linked with some idea of Nordic culture and essentially different people. Now, I don't believe that that's the true reason. I believe there's a general problem associated with both left and corporatist right, who are heavily materialist and that want to, in general, not just in Sweden, but it's clear here, to cut off the connections with the past, because it doesn't fit in to the modern narrative about science and the importance of science and everything being scientific and everything being empirical, and anything that can't be tested or represented should be ignored. So I think there's a deeper thing there, and there's a big danger, and I'm a bit concerned that the failure to learn from the past obscures what we need to learn for the future. And there's a bit of a taking away from the blackboard of memory in that context, which I find a bit disturbing, not just in Sweden, but across the Western world, as if everything in the past is some way essentialist and is therefore against the modern, narrative of global development, and a kind of idea that there should be some monoculture and the past is bad and connection with the past is necessarily represents a particular ideology. I think that's very, very mistaken. We have to draw on our past, and as you said, you've often said that the culture belongs to everybody in that sense. They can draw on it. I've drawn on the Swedish culture, on the ancient culture. I'm drawn as an immigrant in that context. I appreciate what has happened. I want to learn about the past. I think there's something to contribute there. I think we can learn lessons from what has happened to, Linnaeus afterwards, or how his view has come down through Darwin, through Huxley, to Julian Huxley, into transhumanism. I mean, it's an interesting pattern. You have to follow the chain links backwards to understand the past.
It strikes me, James, that you're expressing a kind of sympathy to the idea that earlier you attributed to August Strindberg, that when one becomes disconnected from higher consciousness or Christ consciousness, that one risks opening up to dark forces.
I think that's correct. And also, Swedenborg was very, very clear that although he examined the brain and he tried to examine consciousness, and he made predictions which are, in contemporary times, are seen to be accurate about how the nervous system worked. And he studied it. He came to a point, even before his mystical experience, which said that you cannot explain everything by material means. You cannot, within the boundaries of physiology, explain higher forces. And in particular, his idea was about influx and the idea that forces come into us. And this is in all esoteric traditions. And when we talked about light before, this is the third dimension, where the person opens up to a higher experience, and you get the influx, if you like. So he was very, very clear, after studying all the great literature available to him, regarded as one of the greatest minds ever to exist. He was very, very clear that the material cannot explain everything, and that it was a mistake to believe that. So he's a great representative of this spiritual dimension. But they go together. He wasn't rejecting science, and this is the important thing. They're complementary. But for many scientists, or rather people who are into scientism, they see it as a zero-sum game. They see that it's like a Christian in the lion's den. There's only one of them going to go to survive. And it's a big mistake. And I'm concerned about that in the context of, now you had a great talk with Mitch Horowitz during the week. And I found the talks you've done very, very interesting. Although when you talk about conspiracy, I think that I have a bit of a problem, because H.G. Wells talked about the open conspiracy. It was H.G. Wells who said that there was an open conspiracy, and there should be. And he was arguing in favor of the scientocracy in the New World Order. And, of course, in legislation, you have conspiracies. The government uses the idea of conspiracy when they want to prosecute someone like Charles Manson, for example. So conspiracies exist in law, and they exist in relation to, as we've seen with Gustav and that. So, but the idea of the movement towards a purely scientific global regime, for example, is one that concerns me. And not because of science, but because the idea that science can be elevated to an all-embracing viewpoint. And in the year to come, we're going to see a greater movement towards that. That what is an ideal for some people, it's not an ideal for me, because I think we need balance. We need to have science, we need to have psychology and parapsychology and other force and art, and spirituality has to be there. Without spirit, we're condemned to repeat the failures of the past. And again, I hear the kids tell me from school, they learn about all the wars were caused by religion, and it's just not true. For example, I mean, if you look at Steven Pinker's book on the better angels of our nature, and you look at the charting of the greatest loss of humans in wars, religious wars are only a part of that, a very, very small part of it. So you have these ideas that are being allowed to triumph, and we've moved this year far down the road towards being ruled by scientism, that it concerns me. And we're going to have more, because the current crisis, the bill hasn't come yet. The bill will come this year, and I think people will begin to realize that their opportunity for maneuver is reduced.
Well, James, once again, an incredibly stimulating conversation. Thank you so very much. And of course, I'm pleased to let our viewers know that we're planning even more. So thank you for being with me, James.
Thank you, and thank you for listening to me. And I hope I didn't go on too long on some of those. Apologize if I have done, but it's always great to talk to you. And I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.